Okay, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Aparna Chandra. I'm an associate professor of law here at National Law School, and I head the NK Nambyar Chair on Constitutional Law. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the annual NK Nambyar lecture on constitutional law. We delivered this year by Professor Nivedita Menon. The NK Nambyar annual lecture, and the chair on constitutional law here at NLS, have been endowed by Mr. AK Ramanujan, the former Attorney General for India, in the name of his father, renowned constitutional lawyer, civil liberties lawyer, Menon Krishnan Nambyar. To the students of Indian constitutional law, Mr. Nambyar is, of course, a well-known figure. He is rightly celebrated for his arguments against expansive state power in cases like A.K. Gopalan and I.C. Golaknath. His arguments on reading in due process into Article 21 and on substantive limitations on Parliament's power to amend the Constitution lost out on the day, but they won out eventually in the courts after the tumultuous decades of the 1970s. So won out in Maneka Gandhi in the case of Article 21 and then Keshwar Bharti in the basic structure doctrine in 1973. In between these cases, however, Mr. Nambyar argued many other important, but perhaps not as well known liberties to the raison d'etat, to the reasons of the state are on the ascendancy. I think we would do well to study Mr. Nambyar's legacy of attempting to turn constitutional discourse in the opposite direction. So with these very, very few words, let me welcome you once again to the lecture. I'll hand over the floor to my colleague and the moderator of the day, Dr. Salmoli Choudhuri. Dr. Choudhuri is an assistant professor of law here at National Law School and is a faculty affiliate at the NK Nambyar chair. Dr. Choudhuri will introduce our speaker. If indeed our speaker needs any introduction to this gathering, and but she'll take it forward. Salmoli.
Thanks, Aparna. Welcome to all of you. It's indeed very exciting to have Professor Menon amidst us. Total joy to introduce her, though she requires none, especially for an audience of the generations of scholars that I see here, both teachers and students. Nivedita Menon has been an unmissable name in contemporary politics and feminist theory. As for me, I must say that not just in academic and theoretical work, but also her personal journey and courage has been hugely inspiring. With that, since it's a formal event, I'll definitely share an official introduction. Nivedita Menon is professor at Center for Comparative Politics. Nivedita Menon is professor at Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Her latest book is Secularism as Misdirection, Critical Thought from the Global South, which is published by Permanent Black 2023 and Duke University Press 2024. Perhaps what Professor Menon is going to present to us is one of the chapters from her latest book. Apart from research papers in Indian and international journals, her previous books are Seeing Like a Feminist, 2012, which was updated in its second edition in 2022. It's also one of my favorites. Recovering Subversion, Feminist Politics Beyond the Law, 2004, and Power and Contestation, India After 1989, which was co-written, and it came out in 2007. Another edition was published in 2014. She also has two edited volumes, Gender and Politics in India, which came out in 1999, and Sexualities in 2007, and a co-edited book, Critical Studies in Politics, Exploring Sites, Selves, and Power, which came out in 2014. She's a regular commentator on contemporary issues on the collective blog kafila.online, of which she's one of the founders and active in democratic politics in India. It's also a very rich intellectual resource for many of the debates in the last 2 decades, both political and intellectual. She has translated fiction and non-fiction from Hindi and Malayalam into English and from Malayalam into Hindi, and received the AK Ramanujan Award for translation instituted by Katha. With that, I'll invite Professor Menon to take this.
Thank you so much to, am I audible? No? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to this institution, to the Vice Chancellor, to Dr. Debangana Chatterjee for giving me the opportunity to be here. It's always a delight to come to NLS, now NLSUI, as many of the bright, committed young lawyers I meet in different contexts who are protecting constitutional law and who are protecting the constitution in our courts and protecting the freedom of speech of journalists and lawyers and teachers. Many of these young committed lawyers have a connection to NLS. So I'm very happy to be here. I actually see this young legal fraternity as the last line of defense against authoritarianism. So I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to be presenting parts of my book. And the title, as you know, is Insurgent, Constitutionalism and Radical Frames of Citizenship. And what I'm going to do here is hopefully open up questions both of constitutionalism and of citizenship. I have a feeling the citizenship will be a thread that runs through, but I have a feeling the specific section on citizenship I will have to summarize at the end, otherwise we might have to have dinner here. So let me just present my paper. I want to begin with a performance by Maya Rao in April 2019, on the eve of the general elections that were to bring the Bharatiya Janata Party into power for a second term. Performance artist Maya Rao staged an event at a women's march. So what she did was this: she was wearing a sari. She very ceremoniously stripped herself of the sari, and then she did this. So I need your help. I need to play the first video. Sorry. Yes.
करने वाली हूँ, काटने वाली हूँ, एम्ब्रॉयडरी करने वाली हूँ, सोने के धागे से इस साड़ी पे अपना नाम नहीं, क्या जरूरत है हमें एक ही नाम बार बार Time is running out. स्लोगन के लिए सुन लो, एक ही पन्ने की जरूरत है, one page, half a page, we all it takes. नाम इस पे गाना गाना देखो, ध्यान से देखो। आपने कहा तुम कहाँ जाओगे हम सब सोच रहे हो ये जो 5.5 की है कभी कभी तो 9 मीटर भी चल रहा है भैया बोलो
Okay, so this is what Maya Rao did. She stripped herself of the sari. She then slowly reclothed herself, reciting the values in the preamble to the Constitution. And to anybody in this room, the performance invokes the well-known scene from the Mahabharata of the stripping of Draupadi in the royal court by Dushasan, and her being saved from public nudity by the god Krishna, who miraculously lengthens her strip of cloth indefinitely until Dushasana is exhausted and gives up the attempt. Here, Rao is drawing on the well springs of Hindu culture to subvert it, to indicate instead that the protection of the powerless will today emanate from the Constitution. By the end of the first term of the BJP in 2019, the Hindutva project of establishing Hindu Rashtra was well in place. Minorities and Dalits, as well as dissident voices, even from within the Hindu community, were terrorized, often killed. Legal and mob-implemented diktats on whom to love, what to eat, targeted lynchings had already all become the norm. Assassinations had all become the norm. And the parallel project of this government is accelerated predatory capitalism, in which the state acts as an agent for crony capitalists. Now, through all of this, there was a growing sense that asserting the values of the Constitution was a powerful tool of resistance. Jignesh Mevani, charismatic young Dalit leader and now a member of the Gujarat state legislature, said just before the 2019 elections that he would go to the Prime Minister and place before him a copy of the Constitution and a copy of the Manusmriti and ask him to choose. Mevani was referring to the police complaints against himself and other activists and their potential arrests for attending the Bhima Koregaon massive rally of Dalits, massive assembly of Dalits. And as you know, many people are still in jail for having attended that rally. So this dramatic counterposition of the Constitution to the caste order has a very long history going back to B.R. Ambedkar and highlights the insurgent possibilities in the Constitution. Similarly, as we know, the passing of the Constitutional Amendment Act in December 2019, and these, I won't go into the details of this, but as you know, there were public sit-ins at different parts of the country. Shaheen Bagh was the most iconic. And at most of these, it was a reading of the preamble that animated these protests. You'll find Chandrasekhar Azad, welcome.
You want to start?
Yes, please. So Chandrasekhar Azad, founder of Bhim Army. Bhim Army is named after Ambedkar's first name. It's a mass social movement for the dignity of Dalits, has been arrested more than once. At his meetings, this is a very typical, characteristic picture of Chandrasekhar Azad. He routinely holds up a Hindi copy of the Constitution. His, this is an iconic, like a pin-up picture of Chandrasekhar Azad that you see at protests and rallies and so on. And as you can see, this kind of very, it's a portrayal of a handsome man in dark glasses proud moustache. It's a direct performative challenge to the vicious caste system in which Dalit men have been and are in this 21st century, physically attacked for daring to grow moustaches or ride a horse to their weddings or to dress well. So there's something here in which this performative aspect of Chandrasekhar Azad's body and the body politic, the constitution, the preamble, they go together in a way that challenges a Brahminical Hindutva order. So these are just a few instances of the manner in which the constitution has been owned and reiterated and cited as the source of political legitimacy by different kinds of movements challenging injustice in the 21st century. So I will consider two themes today: constitutionalism as a radically transformative framework and an expansion of the idea of citizenship. So that second part I will hold in abeyance if we run out of time. Can a constitution be insurgent? Insurgency implies rising up against established authority, not necessarily with arms. It's basically to resist an established order. How then can a constitution be insurgent? After all, a constitution establishes an order. Yes, this is generally what a constitution is. It's a set of principles that legitimizes a new order. But it would be a mistake to read the Indian constitution as expressing a singular will and a singular order. And I'm going to be making the argument that the constitutions that come out of anti-imperialist struggles in the global south seem to take a different form from the constitutions that established the regimes of Europe and the US and so on in the 17th to 18th centuries. So I'll come to that in a little detail, but that's the argument that I'm making, that we cannot treat the constitutions of the global south that come out of anti-imperialist struggles, we cannot understand them in the same way as the constitutions of the past. In India, we actually find that the constitution no longer lives the singular life that liberal constitutionalism laid out for it, but has become for many sections of the population a call to radical transformation as well. The constitution has, in a sense, broken out of the confines of the liberal imagination that attempts to keep it in the safe custody of constitutional experts. There are two reasons for this, I suggest. First, the Indian constitution is not merely a liberal document in any sense. It reflects a variety of political opinions from left to right arising from that mass anti-imperialist struggle. And you will see that it's a document full of tensions that are maintained. It tried to balance individual and community equality and special provisions for historically disadvantaged groups, the drive towards industrialization and rights of the peasantry. So these are mutually not really compatible, but the constitution maintains all of them in this space in tension. So this mid-20th century moment is very different in time and space from that which produced the constitutions of the West, which in a sense marked the closure of and an end to political ferment. The Indian constitution, on the contrary, is seen by all the participants in the Constituent Assembly, and apparently till the 21st century, as the beginning of a journey towards what the preamble promises. So that is, I think, one reason why the Indian constitution is, in that sense, or most constitutions of the global south, but we are talking about India, why it's different. The second reason why the constitution is emerging as a banner of revolt for some struggles is specific to India, which is the nature of Indian democracy, which has rarely remained confined to participation in elections. Of course, there are many movements that would definitely not accept the Indian constitution as a basis of their legitimation. But here I am only talking about the many movements that do express their anger towards governments by reasserting the vision of the constitution. The explosion of mass movements across the country over the past decades, and especially over the term of the ongoing regime of the BJP since 2014, is an indication that continuous democratic participation in decision-making has come to be taken for granted by the people. There is thus a growing divide between the people and the ruling elites, including all political parties. No one is sitting back and saying, oh, the laws have been passed, we have to just simply take it. come out on the streets in your thousands, the farmers, in your thousands, again and again and again, until the laws are withdrawn. So there is no sense that laws have been passed, the matter is closed. There is a way in which I voted, I'm done, for the next 5 years, I'm done. No, there is a difference to Indian democracy in the sense that there is a continuous, there is a sense of entitlement to decision making and to continuous decision making, which presents itself in multiple ways. In other words, the Indian Constitution is not a document that has managed to establish one unitary order. If it was meant to legitimize the Brahminical patriarchal class society that India certainly is, it failed. For it ended up reflecting the heterogeneity of the impulses of the anti-imperialist movement. It ended up, therefore, being a porous document with one foot in the future. A comparison of Chile's draft constitution of 2022. So I'm going to just do a quick discussion of Chile's draft constitution, which was now, just 2 years ago in 2022. So a comparison of that with India's enacted in 1950 yields some productive insights. The difference between the constitutions of the West 2 centuries ago and these, I think the difference lies in the fact that rather than closing down possibilities and freezing power structures, the more recent constitutions tend to be documents about open futures based on both democracy and social justice. They are also more likely to maintain the tension between competing interests rather than dissolving them in one direction or the other. This may not be true of all post-colonial constitutions, but Chile and India certainly do embody such a perspective. Another constitution, which I will not be discussing here, but is along these lines, is the Constitution of South Africa, which sees again itself as something pointing to the future. So the famous line in South Africa's constitution is, South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Not those who are born here, not those whose parents were born here. South Africa belongs to all who live in it. So that's a very interesting way of thinking about citizenship. So as I said, citizenship will run through even the constitution part. But so in Chile, there were mass protests against the government in 2019 to 2020 caused by growing inequality. In these protests, feminists, environmentalists, indigenous groups, and anti-neoliberal activists wanting progressive social change came together, elected a left-wing president, Gabriel Boric, by an overwhelming majority. A widespread and inclusive public debate followed regarding the best way forward, and this massive popular movement, which elected a left-wing president, decided that what they needed was a new constitution. So in October 2020, voters approved the creation of a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution, replacing the constitution of the dictator Pinochet. The constituent assembly that came into being was based on reserved seats for indigenous candidates and gender parity. The largest block of the 155 members of the constituent assembly were independents, largely left-wing in their politics. So here I want to pause briefly to alert ourselves to the fact that democracy in the form that it takes, that is representative democracy, where political parties represent us, is barely 200 years old, little over 200 years old. If you look at the movements that have shook the world, from the Arab protests, the We Are the 99%, the Iranian movement against the hijab, but which is really a movement not only against the hijab, but against state authoritarianism. If you think of the farmers' movements, you will notice India against corruption. You will notice that all these movements, the Indignados in Spain, they reject political parties. They reject the legitimacy of political parties. They tell the political parties to stay away. So when political parties enter these spaces, they enter as individuals. So what I'm also suggesting, Sri Lanka, go back, Gota, if you look at the Sri Lanka movement. Now, you could see all these movements as having, in a sense, failed. You could think that they failed, most of them. But I think that what we are seeing is the beginning of a process of leading towards some forms of direct democracy, more localized, and something that you might see in the next 10, 15 years perhaps I won't see it in my lifetime, but there is a shift away from representative democracy and faith in political parties to more direct forms of democracy. So what happens is you have, 155 members of the Constituent Assembly were independents, not linked to any political party, but largely left-wing in their politics. And the person elected to oversee the process, so the woman with the black hair, was a left-wing academic, Lisa Loncon, from the Mapuche indigenous community. She represents a community in which she walked on a dirt stool to go to school, another hour to get back home, and so on. So she's come from that kind of background, and a document emerged that envisaged a range of political and social reforms guaranteeing social rights, including housing, social security, health, work, access to food. Environmental reforms were part of the Constitution. So fighting climate change and protecting biodiversity, native species, natural spaces were part of the state's duty. Political reforms included an element of direct democracy, gender parity, indigenous rights, and so on. So it was a visionary document. It was an ambitious visionary document that represented the spirit of the mass social movement that brought Boric to power. It was then put to plebiscite in September 2022, at which it was decisively defeated by 62% of the popular vote. Boric was forced into a cabinet reshuffle. He removed key left-wing ministers, brought in some figures from Chile's traditional conservative political class. They came up with a constitution which was so conservative that was rejected as well. So that was not rejected, but the old constitution is back. So the sense that analysts have is that the second constitution was deliberately over-conservative so that it would be rejected. So now it's back to status quo ante, which is not the best thing. But what is this defeat of the Chilean constitution, and what should we learn from it? Conservative think tanks and media celebrated the defeat of what they call the populist constitution as a flawed vision of utopia. Anything that is not neoliberal and pro-capitalist is utopian. So it's a flawed vision of utopia and indicative of democratic immaturity. These are terms that the media used, because to be really mature is to be the USA, apparently. A massive campaign, so this happened, and the possibility of the constitution that did emerge and was expected to emerge, so there was a huge, even before the referendum, there was a huge build-up to it, was considered a dangerous threat to the democratically mature neoliberal order, and a massive campaign of disinformation was carried out leading up to the plebiscite. An early 2022 survey found that 58% of Chileans had been exposed to some form of misinformation. CIPER, an investigative media outlet, found out that most of those who voted against the new constitution did so because of false information. There were specters of, I'm not going to say this sounds familiar, but it may sound familiar, okay? There were fears that people's property would be expropriated. That that was mistake. Scare campaigns about unrestricted abortions. Specter of indigenous people having more rights than the rest of the nation. None of this was actually in the constitution, nor would it have been. But this kind of misinformation was a very important reason why people were scared to vote for the constitution as it is. But there's also another feature. The Chilean American writer Ariel Dorfman holds that the rejection of the constitution is not entirely due to the massively well-funded disinformation campaign. He doesn't deny that there was one, but he says it was equally attributable to the uneasiness within a large majority about the emphasis on the autonomy of indigenous peoples and the insistence on plurinationalism in a land that prides itself on unity. Now, this is interesting. I don't know if you've noticed the name of, so there was a coup attempt recently in Bolivia, which was thwarted partly by the state forces, but partly because people came out on the roads to stop the coup attempt to overthrow the left-wing president. But Bolivia calls itself now, since 2009, the plurinational state of Bolivia. So think about what that means. Because we have taken it for granted that states are nation states. One nation with one culture, one history which goes back thousands of years. And that is how all nation states have been built from France onwards. It's not just in the global south. But what is happening in Latin America is something worth learning from, that there is a move towards recognizing that states can be plurinational. It's not anti-national to think about a state as plurinational, but in Chile it didn't work. In Chile, there were enough non-indigenous people who felt threatened, and then of course what happens is plurinationalism is counterposed to unity. So if you're plurinational, you cannot be united. United implies uniformity, and uniformity implies the dominant norm, right? If you're all uniform, you all have to be the same as something. What is that something? Everyone has to be like me, or everybody has to be like X or like Y, right? So plurinationalism is threatening, the idea of plurinationalism was threatening, Errol Dorfman says, to the dominant non-indigenous people. And he suggests that what plurinationalism threatens, that is the attempt to bring indigenous nations and their languages, customs, and culture out of invisibility. What it threatens is an identity innumerable Chileans felt to be their deepest, that is their European heritage. So what we learned from this is that the European heritage cannot accommodate the rejection of secular nationalism by indigenous peoples, both through their non-secular beliefs and practices, that is, the indigenous, they have spirits, they worship spirits, the land means something, the mountain means something, I'm part of nature. These are spiritual beliefs. And so they're seen as threatening nationalism through and challenging the idea of one nation founded on the dominant values of that society. Now, Dorfman does not see that plebiscite that rejected the constitution as the end of the road, but as one more faltering step in the search for justice. After all, 80% of the electorate voted to end the existing constitution, which had been instituted under the Pinochet regime. And so this indicates the desire for significant reforms. So we cannot see the rejection of the new constitution as a simple victory for conservatism. Any truly democratic road reflects heterogeneity and differences. There are steps on a road, and on a road which might fork, which might turn somewhere, which might become something else. A fork might become some other feature, and so on, right? So we have to think of this as a journey. We have to think of democracy as a journey, and any truly democratic road reflects heterogeneity and differences. And the fact that the people of Chile participated assertively in this process, sending the draft back to be reconsidered, indicates confidence among them that their voices matter. The very process of drafting a radical constitution is linked to the battle for transforming common sense. Any new constitution that emerges will represent a great deal of compromise, to be sure. But I suggest that such a constitution can be insurgent too, provided that rather than erasing internal tension between polar opposite political positions, that tension is maintained. And the Indian experience with our 72-year-old constitution is an important illustration of this claim. Let me now, not 72 years, 74-year-old constitution. Let me now offer, yes, my maths is suddenly deserting me. Let me now offer a glimpse of two contemporary movements in India, the Pathargadi movement in the tribal belt across Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and Orissa in central India, and the campaign against Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code that criminalized same-sex desire, to reveal a politics of performing what I call insurgent constitutionalism. Now, Pathargadi, and many of you may be familiar with it, sweeping across the tribal belt of the states of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and Odisha since early 2018, is a political movement in which the tribal people have reworked the tradition of putting up stone slabs across their lands. Patthar is patthar. in Hindi. I mean, that's how we could translate it. So traditionally, Pathargadi is a generic name for a ritual performed by many tribes of this region for several purposes. It could be for the last rites of a person who has died. It could be to perpetuate the existence of ancestors, etc., to demarcate a village boundary. There are many different kinds of Pathargadi which have different names, different kinds of, so Sasandiri, they have different names, but Pathargadi is the generic name. Now, the contemporary political performance of this tradition involves the erecting of giant green painted stone slabs with lettering on them asserting tribal sovereignty over their lands, prohibiting the entry of government officials and other what they call outsiders. Some of them, so what do these things have? What do these stones have? Some of them list the names of those martyred in the cause of tribal autonomy, in police firing or in jail. The Pathargadi revolution captured the imagination of village after village, and wherever they stand, the movement declares, marks the limit of the authority of the Indian government. So it's a very ceremonial process. They erect these slabs. It involves the whole village. Now, what is interesting is that many of these green slabs have either sections from PESA, the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, which was passed in 1996, which explicitly gave tribal people rights over their lands. Many of them have this. Others have sections from the Constitution. So this legislation, the 1996 PESA legislation, was the outcome of long struggle and negotiations with the government. And inscribed on these stone slabs are these words taken from PESA 1996. Every village shall have a Gram Sabha, and every Gram Sabha shall be competent to safeguard and preserve the traditions and customs of the people, their cultural identity, and customary modes of dispute resolution. So customary modes of dispute resolution refers to traditional institutions of tribal communities, which have actually been sidelined by the introduction of PRI, Panchayati Raj institutions. So the PESA is seen as having restored these rights to tribal communities. Of course, local tribal community councils are often patriarchal and entrench the rights of local traditional elites. But on the other hand, PRI often act as agents of the Indian state in the dispossession of tribal communities. Because let us remember that the lands of indigenous people all over the world are lands that are rich in the resources that capitalism needs. It's very simple. Follow capitalism, stupid, as they say, right? Follow the money, stupid. Wherever you look, whether it is the Alaskan Native Americans whose the oil pipe that goes across their ancestral burial grounds, all over the world, indigenous people live on lands that are rich in resources that capitalism needs and which they wish to let remain in the soil. They don't want to take out the various minerals. They don't want that, right? So in India, the fifth schedule and so on, so many of the stones actually directly invoke the Constitution, in which collective ownership of tribal lands is protected by the fifth schedule and other specific articles. So the history of militant struggle of the tribal people against dispossession of their lands started in the 19th century, started under British colonialism and continues until today under what one can only call internal colonialism. Now, so what happens is that they set up these things. So what is interesting is that they're setting up these pathas. They're refusing entry to Indian officials. But what are they flourishing in the face of the Indian state? Nothing less than the Constitution. The Indian state is not bigger, is not stronger, is not more legitimate than the Constitution. That is what these movements are saying. So several leaders of the Pathargadi movement have been arrested under charges of sedition. These are just a couple of images. This was just the people arrested in 2016 under sedition. And these are from 2014 to 2020, the cases and their disposal and so on. As we know, sedition is not in the new Bharatiya, in the BNS set of laws, but you no longer need sedition because the control, authoritarianism of the state and police processes has been already brought in and institutionalized. So sedition as a provision is no longer necessary. So the movement faces the full might of state repression, but it continues. There's a second round, it waxes and wanes. Movements have very long histories. You can arrest the entire leadership of a movement. It might die down for 10 years, but it's not going to end so simply. So it's telling that the performative act of erecting traditional tombstones to invoke the constitution and legal provisions as a mode of declaring tribal sovereignty over their lands is declared by the government as sedition, which is conduct or speech inciting people to rebel against the authority of a state. It appears that states, and not just the current government, place their own authority over the authority of the constitution. But both the Pathargari movement and the state response to it suggest that the Indian constitution has the potential to challenge centralization, authoritarianism, and dispossession of indigenous peoples for the benefit of capitalist land acquisitions. Now we come to how the queer movement, this is just an image. I thought it would wake you up if you were asleep. It's because it's nothing from the core. And this actually I won't go into in great detail because I have a feeling all of you are very familiar with the kind of arguments that the movement, the decades-long movement to remove Section 377, I mean, you know the journey. So basically, the Section 377 had to be removed. The movement starts from the 90s. The public visibility of the queer movement in India, allied to feminism, can be traced to the 1990s. The politics of this movement has always tried to locate sexuality and sexual identity within other identity-producing networks of class, caste, community identity, both acknowledging them as well as demanding inclusion within them. We also know that there are Hindu supremacist strands within queer politics, as well as individuals who simply want to live their lives and don't want to be political and just want their lives to be decriminalized. But the movement as a whole, like feminist politics in India, tends towards the left and is generally mistrustful of the state. So the decision by the NGO NAS Foundation to file a PIL in 2001 challenging the constitutional validity of Section 377 was not universally welcomed by the movement. So what is interesting about the way the queer movement operates is that with the constitution and with the law and so on, is that there is a continuous both resistance to dealing with this in the legal domain, but now that it's there, we have to fight it. That seems to be, so there's a continuous auto-critique from within the queer movement of this mode of going to court. So the decision by NAS Foundation to do it was not universally welcome, partly because it did not come out of widespread discussions within the movement, and partly because many within the movement felt that the work of social transformation should precede entry into legal processes. Nevertheless, in the 17 years that followed, other petitioners joined in, including, among others, a coalition called Voices Against 377. And also there were other groups like Parents of Gay Children, psychiatrists, and a group of teachers, of whom I am one. So, what we did in the teachers' petition was that we argued that Section 377, we argued against Section 377 on the basis of implicit constitutional values. This was not an argument that made any big headway in court. I'm just sharing with you what our petition was, because it shows you one way of engaging with the Constitution. It was one of those which I think we just got lost in the process. So I'm not claiming it was extremely successful or anything, but we worked on a petition in which we, so the implicit constitutional values, we made the argument that Section 377 vitiates for everybody and not just for gay people the general atmosphere of free expression, learning, inquiry, and dignity that an academic environment should ensure. So when you're all law students and you're studying legal theory, you know that this is not an argument that will work in court. So the court wants to see the affected person. And in fact, the final success had to do with the affected couples being present there. So we were actually making an argument we knew would make no headway, but we felt we needed to make it. In our group, there were people who identified as queer and people who did not identify as queer. But we wanted to say that the existence of 377 on the statute books is not something for them, for some other people, for some queer people out there. It is something that is humiliating for every single person, every single citizen of India. It is humiliating to have a statute which runs counter to the spirit of openness and acceptance of difference that should mark, particularly because we were teachers, we said modern academic spaces. The existence of Section 377, we argued, is not only an affront to those who are non-heterosexual, but it is an affront to each and every person in the academy who believes that every teacher and student has dignity and that learning is a continuous and lifelong process. So we claim that these ideas are implicit in the values of the preamble to the Constitution. And then you know that the Delhi High Court read down Section 377, Supreme Court overturned this judgment, and then it went back. So there's a long process of legal intervention. And one of the key arguments that was made by the petitioners against Section 377, reiterated in the Delhi High Court judgment of 2009 that read down the section, is when this term enters popular discourse, constitutional morality, right? Where the argument was made in the judgment that popular morality cannot prevail over constitutional morality, an idea that was derived here from B.R. Ambedkar. It has a much longer history. I'm sure you study it. Now it has taken a new life. This term constitutional morality has taken on a new life, I feel, especially after this judgment. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar used this in his speech, The Draft Constitution Delivered in 1948. Analyzing the phrase as he used it, Pratap Bhanu Mehta identified three strands to Ambedkar's understanding of constitutional morality: freedom and self-restraint, recognition of plurality, and suspicion of any claims to singularly and uniquely represent the will of the people. So Pratap Bhanu Mehta says that freedom and self-restraint, recognition of plurality, and suspecting any claim to singularly and uniquely represent the will of the people is constitutional morality, according to Ambedkar. Now, these, one could argue, and I do, are the essential conditions of a democracy: mutual respect for one another's rights, acceptance and protection of a plurality that is not closed, that is, more and newer pluralities can emerge. We haven't reached the point where we know all the possible pluralities have been reached. Right? In my lifetime, I have seen more and more plural identities emerge, and so will you. I'm addressing the younger people in the room when I say so will you. And third, that no one movement or party or government can claim to fully represent the will of all the people. It's interesting that Ambedkar, in fact, did not want the term secular in the preamble. The reason, I hope you know, was because he said, and I just told you what he sees as constitutional morality, he said the Constitution is already imbued with all the values that secularism espouses. We don't need to use a term that is so contentious. So when the Hindu supremacist regime removes the word secular from the preamble, as it did on 26th of January 2024, it shows a complete ignorance of why that term was not there in the initial, not because it was not felt necessary, but it was redundant. The Constitution was already secular because it was imbued with these values, is what Ambedkar said. So the 2009 judgment said that popular morality is shifting, subjective changes with time, but constitutional morality represents the fundamental values of the Constitution, which is the values of the preamble. So these were the two movements. I see this invocation of the Constitution by different sections of democratic movements to challenge a colonial era criminal provision that criminalized same-sex activity as a kind of performance in which constitutional morality was produced as a supreme value by the performers. So I'm not going to go into the different kinds of queer critiques that have been made regarding this campaign and the judgment, the recourse to the law rather than bringing about radical social transformation. or the reliance on the right to privacy, which is a very complex issue, and feminists have rightly been suspicious of this for a very long time. So the reliance on the right to privacy rather than challenging the liberal notion of privacy that protects compulsory heterosexuality. So there are a number of queer critiques as well. I'm not going to go into that. But I do want to also, and again, many of you would be familiar with Danish Sheikh, who was involved with the campaign, legal scholar, legal theorist, probably from NLS, if I'm not mistaken, no? I just assume that everybody interesting is either from JNU or NLS. Yeah, I'm really objective, as you can see. So Danish Sheikh actually wrote, this is a scene from his play called Contempt, in which, so this is not directly linked to the Constitution, but I thought it would be interesting to know. What he did was, he edited exchanges from transcripts of the court hearings in 2012 and juxtaposed the transcripts to a series of accounts from the actual lives of queer Indians. And he said, I use those stories as guiding frameworks to weave an imagined account. In the world of the play, these narratives are delivered by characters referred to as witnesses and given the label of affidavits. So their lives become affidavits. Their actual living lives become documents, etc. So that's what he's worked with, and this play has been performed many times, and it's also published. You can find it. The play is called Contempt. So the Indian Constitution turns out to be not a simple seal of legitimacy on ruling dispensations of caste, class, and gender. It is a document that emerged from the acute conflicts and contestations in the anti-colonial struggle outside, and from the contentious debates inside the Constituent Assembly. Many of you may have read the Constituent Assembly debates. It's they're really interesting to see how very many different views come together to produce this delicate document, which is so delicately poised on so many contradictory ideas. Think about the fundamental rights chapter, which protects both individual rights and community rights. Think about the ways in which directive principles and fundamental rights. So what you do is you don't just try to arrive at a consensus. The Indian Constitution or the Chilean Constitution is not a consensus document. It is a document full of tensions, which maintains those tensions. And I think that's really productive for a democracy. I will take another 5 minutes, if I may. Another 5 minutes, to introduce you very briefly to some ideas, which might, because I don't have the time to go into them. So one idea is something that Kalpana Kannadiran, the scholar whose work many of you would be familiar with. Kalpana uses this term constitution as commons. Constitution hyphen as commons. And I find it a very interesting and productive way of thinking about the Constitution. And I would like to counterpose it to the label populist, which is a kind of now a pejorative term that is used in a very broad way. So I want to counterpose these two. And how there is an assumed distinction between democracy and populism. And it seems to me that democracy is the term that we use, both left and neoliberal thought. Populism, that democracy is the term that we use for populations properly disciplined by the institutions of parliamentary democracy. So when we say democracy, we mean people who go out there, stand in line, vote, and they're properly disciplined by parliamentary democracy. And populism, think about it. Think about every time you now hear the word populism, look at what is being referred to. And this is a problem across the political spectrum from left to right. Populism is used to refer to the mass public presence of people outside such institutions. Sometimes they're right-wing, often they're left-wing, sometimes not clearly identifiable with any one particular political ideology. And they may come together around a signifier like corruption or economic inequality. So from this, and I'll come back to constitutional commons in a minute, I want to ask the question, what is the value of the term populism? Does it not simply indicate the assertion of an uncontrolled democracy against liberalism? What we've seen globally over the late 20th century onwards is a hijacking of institutions of liberal democracy by economic, social, and political elites to subvert both the possibility of redistribution and the protection of older collective rights. Indeed, neoliberal regimes have ensured a redistribution of wealth from the poor to the wealthy. That's what we've actually seen in the world. So if we recognize that the pejorative charge of the term populism is intended to recover democracy as civilized by liberal institutions, we might need to be more suspicious of its usage. The insurgent constitutionalism that I've discussed here may be a way of doing democracy from the left that challenges, redefines, and questions the assumed link between liberalism and democracy. And this is where I come to the term constitution as commons in Kalpana's phrasing. The supposedly objective analyses by think tanks of the rejection of Chile's first constitution claimed, what did they claim? What was, oh, we are not at all surprised the constitution was rejected. Why? Because the elected drafting body lacked expertise. If any of you has read Timothy Mitchell's The Rule of Experts, so expertise, it lacked expertise. It lacked political acumen. It consisted of inexperienced independents and leftists. It was suggested that the next attempt to draft should include more experienced experts and political parties rather than independents. The necessity for a new constitution, the analyst said, so the new constitution should not undermine the country's reputation among international investors. In other words, everything that has been rejected globally by movements pushing for forms of direct democracy in this century, whether, as I said, it's all those things, you know, Syriza, Indignados, the Arab protests, etc. Everything that has been rejected globally by movements pushing for forms of direct democracy in this century, political parties, experts, the neoliberal order, have to be brought back for any constitution to work. This seems to be the. So what we actually see since the first decades of this century is a recognition of the failure of representative democracy to represent anything but the ruling elites. In this context, constitution as commons is a fruitful direction. Kalpana Naviran outlines the idea as an insurgency to wrest citizenship from the jaws of enclosure. So she's counterposing commons to enclosure, right? Enclosure is a way in which common property is hedged about and fenced in. In her words, the Indian Constitution as commons resurrects the moral economy of the Constitution and its ethical foundations immersed in empathy, most evident in the work of Dr. Ambedkar. So this way in which the Constitution enters the streets and universities, which I have characterized as escaping the safe custody of constitutional experts, was noted by Kalpana Naviran too as the shift in legitimacy from the formal holders of constitutional power to the multitudes that deliberate on the Constitution on streets and campuses and explore and interpret its meanings. The rejection of the draft Constitution by the people of Chile is as much an indication of people's claim to, that is, even the rejection, I feel, is as much a claim, an indication of people's claim to ownership of the process of constitutionalism, as is the performance and claim to the Indian Constitution by diverse groups and communities. Unlike the liberal idea that a constitution is about establishing a minimum framework for engagement with difference, which implies a consensus, the most productive outcome is for a constitution to retain tensions that reflects the fault lines in a society. A consensus would involve a closure that can render invisible the operation of power, conflict, and heterogeneity. On the other hand, a retaining of tension would enable democratic politics to dance along those fault lines such that hitherto unimagined futures may be seen gleaming in the distance. I'll just conclude with another short performance. Sorry, I'll need your help for the last video. It's just a very, very small part of a performance called Samvidhan Rap, which is again just meant to wake you up, if you were.
ये गीत हमने एक नाम दिया है अब इस गीत को हमने रैप के फॉर्म में बनाया है और इस गीत गीत का नाम भी मैंने दिया है संविधान।
Thank you so much for the fantastic lecture. Are there immediate questions? Else I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative and ask the first one. Okay. I see your hand first. So.
Professor Menon, thank you for that lecture. I wanted to ask you about. I wanted to ask you about your ideas of heterogeneity and plurality that you said are imbued in the nation state. In fact, there isn't a nation state, but that's a plurality. So just in context of that, when you talked about tribal agitations against government land encroachment.
Talked about?
Tribal agitations against the government's land encroachment. I was wondering whether there are fragmentations within those tribal agitations as well, because it should follow from these ideas of heterogeneity and plurality. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about those fragments. Should we take a few?
Yes. Do you mind just saying your name, because then I can remember. What's your name?
My name is Survi.
Survi. You notice I'm not saying identify yourself.
Should we take a bunch of questions first?
Yeah.
Please keep your questions brief.
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. I'm a bit sad that we couldn't talk much about citizenship, but
I can do that now.
in the questions here, bring up. So a word that I picked up from the talk here is tension, right? The tension that is between liberal aspects of our constitution, the transformative aspects. And something that really enunciates or brings about this is the part 4 of our constitution, which is the directive principles. But most of the insurgent movements that we see are about claiming rights rather than saying to the government, please enforce our directive principles. For example, adequate means of livelihood. We don't see insurgent movements saying, give us livelihood in that sense, right? So my question is pretty simple. Have we given up on our government to make any substantial changes? And is these insurgent movements more to catch the attention of the court and the attention of the media rather than as against the government? My name is Arif. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Shraddha. So thank you very much for the lecture. So in the context of the tribal struggle against the state, shouldn't we be proud of the fact that we have a first woman tribal president? I mean, isn't it a positive constitutional development in the face of like so much negativity that is bandied about?
Okay, so there are 3 questions. So the first question should be right. Of course, there would be, so I was speaking of a specific set of movements around Pathalgadi. So I was not talking about the heterogeneity of the people called tribes in India, which of course are very different in Central India as opposed to Northeast India, etc. And in any movement, inside the movement, and I did say this, that there is more than likely to be internal conflicts around gender, patriarchy, other, whatever the dominant power is there. As I said, the tribal councils could well be all those things. So the point is not to suggest or to glorify or to romanticize any kind of protest. That's why I was putting together from right to left, everything, whether it is we are the 99% or whether it's India against corruption, which has taken a path that one did not expect or one maybe many expected, etc. So what I'm saying is that these kinds of heterogeneities are present inside the feminist movements. They're inside, I presented the heterogeneities within the queer movements. So yes, so I've not studied the Pathalgadi movements enough to know what are the internal conflicts and how do they negotiate those on a daily basis. I don't know, but someone could study that. That's an important aspect of studies. But by no means am I suggesting that each heterogeneity is homogeneous in itself. No, it's heterogeneity all the way down, right? So there's that. Sahil, are they? So when I say use the word tension, I was not talking of one kind of tension between liberal and transformative, because I don't necessarily see these as opposites, right? There's a certain liberal vision that drives the constitution. There are other visions that also drive the constitution. So I don't see liberal as not transformative necessarily. When I'm talking about tensions, I mentioned a few. For example, the constitution thinks about industrialization as well as protecting the rights of the peasantry. Now, these two are incompatible. They are in fact incompatible. It has to be one or the other. Any kind of industrialization involves land acquisition. It involves, because that's how industrialization took place in England in the 16th century. There is no way. So farming has to become capitalist for it. So I was thinking of that. I was thinking of community rights versus individual rights. So there are multiple tensions, rights. So individual rights of women versus community rights, which are often not about protecting women at all, right? So, so that's my first response. And then you were saying that why don't movements claim what the directive principles promise rather than claiming rights? I don't think we had an interesting chat about this earlier with sorry, I'm going blank. What is wrong with me? Radhika. I had a long chat with Radhika about this, whether the movements are based on rights. Are they asking for rights in that sense? Is Pathalgadi asking for rights? No, Pathalgadi is asking for self-government. And you can term it as a right to self-government, but I don't see what it's adding. Because self-government means a variety of things. It's a very, in that context, it's a variety of things, and it could mean multiple forms of internal dialogue, etc. So I don't think it is that movements, or when the farmers march and demand MSP, etc. I don't see the advantage in terming these as rights. What is happening is that they are demanding certain specific values, the protection of farming, the possibility to make farming an actual livelihood. If you think about people who drive cars, for example, drivers, those are professional drivers in cities, many of them are forced to do this and live, well, Bangalore is still a pleasant city in terms of weather, but you're forced to live in hot and alienating Delhi. When you have some farm, you have a small piece of land, but you can't farm because farming has been made completely unviable, right? So what you're demanding is not a right from the government, it is actually a certain set of values which might involve the government either leaving you alone or the government not subsidizing the rich at the expense at your expense, etc. So I'm not sure that insurgent movements are, and some of them are in, the right to livelihood in the directive principles is implied in the farmers' movement. So they're not using terms like fundamental rights and directive principles. And I don't think it's to capture the attention of courts and so on. I think this is the way, it's an old tradition of being on the streets to force the government to yield something. So that's what I would say. Sudha, was it? Sorry, yeah. Of course, one must be very proud that the first tribal president has been appointed and she's a woman. But if you, can we in a democracy be satisfied with individual icons who perform a titular function? Can we say that, and it's important, I'm not saying it's not important, the optics are very important, but it cannot remain at the level of optics. So if you look at what is happening to actual tribals in this country, and the way that their land is being discussed, we have to talk about that as well. While you can keep some pride also for the president being a tribal.
If I may ask the fourth question. So you delineated in your talk how
Okay, this is where I confess. This is not a confess. This is what might be called TMI. But you need to know I'm deaf in my left ear. So I'm unable to tell the direction of sound. Whenever I say this in India, people kind of giggle and laugh because we don't know how to talk about disability without giggling and laughing. I'm giggling and laughing, but it is a disability, which is why when people are speaking, I'm like that because I can't tell the direction of sound. And you're sitting directly on my left. Now I will continue.
I actually could have a similar problem, although it's not clinically checked, so I need to get myself checked. So with my right here.
Yeah, okay.
But coming back to my question, you delineated in your talk how insurgent politics in many places have made constitution their centerpiece. My question is whether then we are also required to rethink, reconceptualize the constitution itself. To briefly explain my question, often constitution and constitutionalism are looked at as synonymous concepts. But I think constitutionalism is a very particular ideology that talks about the supremacy of the constitutional document, also perhaps supremacy of judicial interpretation of the document, and perhaps also constitutionalist determination of democratic politics. So constitution over democracy. But I don't think that's what is happening, given the kind of phenomena that we're seeing around us. So for instance, when we saw the MPs taking over saying Jai Samvidan, or even in anti-CAA, the reading of preamble, in many of these contexts, I think the content is quite, the constitution is quite denuded of its content. And it's almost being used or invoked as an empty signifier, if I may, because you're also interested in psychoanalysis and you're writing this psychoanalytically inflected. So the constitution is also being invoked as an empty signifier. So, do you think that it's also a time when we should also reconceptualize what constitution really means? Maybe also invoking your Manto's character among the way, without even knowing the content of Government of India Act 1935, he has this optimism about its emancipatory potential.
Should I just answer this?
Or should we take a few more? Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I saw you first. So okay, so first question for Sanjay, and then the person sitting next.
Yeah, wonderful talk, Mr. Menon. I remember nostalgic.
Hi, Sanjay.
And at last disability came. Although I wish your chapter would have also had a gist of disability, but alas, it did not. At least till where I reached, I did not find. I was inquisitively exploring for the same, and I was asking my colleague before coming here why disabilities are absent from discourse, right? So that's my disappointment. But nevertheless, conceptually, I have a question. So that I'm not stereotyped as a disability rights scholar only. So my question is, when I was reading your chapter, I was finding multiple concepts in use: constitutional morality, transformative constitutionalism, insurgent constitutionalism, constitution as commons, etc. So, are you trying to use all these concepts synonymously, or do you believe that optically, by way of optics, or by way of effective discourse, insurgent constitutionalism makes more sense as an effective vehicle of radical politics? In other words, otherwise, do you believe that all these concepts are synonymous? Because our courts do not use insurgent constitutionalism. Courts use transformative constitutionalism and constitutional model. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll come to you.
Professor Menon, laws are limited, whereas politics is not, right? And at the same time, laws are organic and structured, whereas politics is not organic and it is totally not structured at all. Now, it's nice to see that you say that, Dr. Ambedkar says secularism is a part of the constitution itself. You don't need a separate term. But how are we going to achieve the preamble as such? The values of the preamble when dignity and fraternity is a question in India? Because you don't see dignity. 97% of the people of the country, dignity is a question. The economically weaker sections are looked at in a very different way. And there is no fraternity. So when these two are not there, you can't really achieve equality, justice, and liberty, right? So how do you find a way forward with that aspect?
There's one hand raised.
So this,
If three
can
questions.
I just take
Yeah.
three questions?
If I may, only because my question was very similar to Salmoli's. I was also thinking of Manto's new constitution. The question I had is, what has the constitution got to do with it? I mean, is it just that because constitution provides us a script of sort of legitimacy, political legitimacy at the current moment, and a way to speak to state power in its own terms, that we use the constitution? If the script of political legitimacy was religion, for example, we would be having this discussion about insurgent religious norms or something, or reinterpretation of bottoms up reinterpretation of religion, so on and so forth. Is there something about the constitution here that makes it, apart from the fact that it is the language of state power, that makes it the site for this insurgency, the site for sort of claiming justice? The reason I ask that is because, for example, the Pathalgadi movement, invoking the fifth schedule as a document of self-government, fifth schedule is the exact opposite of the document of self-government. It is a way to impose state and centralize state control over areas that are seen as, less than, right? So, and that's pretty much the way in which the Constituent Assembly talks about it. So, so in many ways, the Constitution is the problem, right? It centralizes power, it creates all the state power. So I'm just wondering to what extent this is about the Constitution, or it's just about this being the available language for challenging state.
Okay, so let me then address, let me first talk to Sanjay. And say you're absolutely right, and I'm so sorry that it does become like this. And I feel as if I have gone through some decades in which I would say gender, and many of us would say, what about gender? And say we don't want to be stereotyped as women scholars and so on. So I can only say, yes, it is a gap, it's a yawning gap. And I won't say I'm sorry to you, because it's not about you. And it is a gap that I should address, and I have not addressed, and I take it seriously. I take the criticism seriously. I would want to think about what would change in any of those arguments if I added disability as a factor, taking into account the massive scholarship on disability that exists. What would have changed, I wonder. So you've put this thought into my head now, and I will definitely think about how
we will celebrate inclusion more pompously.
of course. So let me just, since I've started talking about that, your question. So that's the first thing. It is an absence, it is a gap. And I want to think about what adding it would do conceptually to my overall argument. I'm taking that very seriously. I don't have an answer right now. Your second question is also very interesting. Am I using these terms synonymously? I'm actually not. Constitutional morality, constitution as commons, insurgent constitutionalism. These are used in very specific contexts. I'm not using them as if they're synonymous. Insurgent constitutionalism refers to certain kinds of movements like Patagari. Constitution as commons is not something that has come into being, but Kalpana Thannabijan is suggesting that that's one way of thinking about what the constitution is, that it somehow just entered, it's escaped enclosure and entered, the space of the commons. And here commons would refer to, we use it in the context of intellectual property rights, so the constitution in that sense, and constitutional morality in the sense in which Ambedkar used it, but in which it has come to be used. So it has these terms or four terms are used very specifically. I don't mean them to be synonymous. Salmoli's question. See, I don't see the term empty signifier as something that suggests that it has no meaning, right? An empty signifier is very powerful. An empty signifier is one which, when you say corruption, and if you're saying it's an empty signifier, it means that corruption means X to me and Y to you and Z to you and A to you.
And specific signified.
So there are specific ways in which it is filled by people participating. So you're able to bring together with a common minimum program of corruption, people from left to right, people from across the political spectrum. So if you say that the constitution has become an empty signifier, you're right in this sense. It's not a negative, pejorative thing to say, when the reason, of course, they started saying Jai Samvidhan was because someone said Jai Hindu Rashtra, and then someone else said Jai Hindu. I think it was Shashi Tharoor who said Jai Samvidhan. He was disciplined by the speaker, so after that it was kind of a defiant assertion. It became a kind of a slogan, but it was interesting. So it is interesting, and this then comes to Aparna's, it does link to Aparna's question, that what has constitution got to do with it? Right? What is love got to do with it? Which is what I heard in my head when she said, what has the constitution got to do with it? When we study contemporary politics, if one is not studying it in a vanguardist normative way, this is what they should do. This is what the movement should do. If we are not studying it like that, and assuming we are not part of that, because many of us are also activists, but for the moment I'm being only scholar. When we look at movements, we see that there are different points at which different symbols, different materials acquire a certain significance. Salt acquired a significance. The man walked to the sea and picked up salt. That's all he did, right? So is salt an empty signifier? Yes. Could it have been anything else? Yes. But it was salt. So I think what is happening is, if we say that it could, maybe if this were, maybe if it was another kind of a debate, if it was about, I'm going to, as you said, could it be insurgent religion? Well, that's what liberation theology is. That is what, when women invoke provisions of the Quran to fight triple talaq, because let us remember, maybe I don't need to say this here, but sometimes I feel I have to say it everywhere. Triple talaq was outlawed as a result of a massive grassroots movement by Muslim women. It was not a gift of the government. Massive. Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan is a massive movement. They have challenged the patriarchy of their community, and they have fought this out, and they have won the case. So what they are doing is a kind of, and there were other Muslim groups, smaller groups, the Bebak Collective in Bombay, for example, which was using constitutional ideas. But BMLA used the Quran. So you have two ways of using, two ways of challenging triple talaq. One as citizens using the constitution, and one as Muslim women challenging the community's patriarchy and the patriarchal reading of the Holy Book. So yes, it could be anything, but it is the constitution. What I'm intrigued by is that when you have sort of lived long enough as a scholar, you also go through a journey, you know. And we all started off, those of us, many of us, I didn't say we all, but many of us on the left started off as critics of Nehru and critics of the Constitution. And we are still critics of a certain kind of Nehruvian development pattern, etc. And we are very critical of the Constitution. It was formulated by a Constituent Assembly, which was based on property qualifications, etc. There have been any number of critical works on the Constitution. We were talking about this earlier, Radhika and I, the communal Constitution as a communal document, the Constitution as elitist, Shobhanlal Dattagupta, and so on. Faisal Devji has a critique of the Constitution. So there is a critique of the Constitution, and it is very valid, but it's very interesting that what was produced, the fifth schedule was produced to control, but it is being interpreted by the movement very differently. You see. So yes, it could be anything, but so all of us who were very critical of the Constitution, what happens? And as scholars, we don't, at least I don't think that this is the kind of scholarship we should do. When you see that something is happening that is animating people, we have to try and understand it. So suddenly we realize that there's something to the Constitution and the preamble, and suddenly it's also the zeitgeist. Pathalgari uses it, CAA uses it. So more and more and more, it gets used, and it's used in different, the MP from Srinagar said, I in a hymn, right? So these words then, there is an effect of amplification. There's an amplification effect. This movement uses it, another movement uses it, and it is an empty signifier. The Constitution can mean many things to many people. And the Constitution can mean also a very restrictive document, and that is also something out there. Your questions are, I'm not sure laws are organic. So you said laws are limited, politics is not. That I agree. Laws are organic, politics is not. I would say the opposite, that politics is organic. If by organic you mean the way you say, for example, Gramsci uses it also, organic as in springing from everyday interactions rather than formally produced, meeting someone in the library rather than meeting them through a dating app, right? So organic as opposed to a formalized structure, that is what I would call, so laws are not organic in that sense. Politics is very much organic in that sense. So that's the first part. And therefore I am rightly suspicious of laws, and I have I've written about it, and I'm suspicious of the law as an instrument of transformation. The last part of your question, dignity and fraternity are not there, and how are we to achieve equality? We can only struggle. And I think things have changed. Look at Chandrasekhar Azad. So we have to keep struggling, and we have to keep fighting and risking and so on. We have to end manual scavenging first thing. We have to do these things. We have to keep fighting. I don't see any other option.
Okay, one last round of questions. Maybe towards the back.
Professor, on the idea of
My name first.
my name is Aditya. On the idea of the Constitution and the preamble setting us out on a journey, do you envision a post-constitutional future where constitutions are unnecessary to the constraint of power and the guiding of decision making? And do you think an overemphasis on what constitutions can mean for people and the change that they can bring obstructs the envisioning of this?
Yes, first.
His hand was up first. Okay, so then women, then.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Gautam. Ambedkar says in the last speech to the Constituent Assembly that now that we have a constitution, we should let go of satyagraha, civil disobedience, etc. So, so why then maintain tensions within the constitution if the whole aim of the project was to let go of these methods and work the constitution? But you suggest that we should instead have tension within the maintenance of tension within the constitution. The exact opposite of what standard lawyer thinks, which is that the constitution is to depoliticize and sacralize certain questions and values. So I perhaps don't fully comprehend why use the constitution to maintain tensions.
Manoj, because his hand goes up first, Professor Menon responded, so, yeah.
Hi, my name is Manoj. So my question is that you used performative examples in your lecture. And I want to ask you what you think about performativity and what is the value it brings. To me, what it signifies is that it signifies some sort of pathos and an affective attachment with constitutional values. So it's not just a rational document you're fighting out in the court, but there's an emotional element to it. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about why performativity matters.
Really interesting question. Actually, I think I was referring to Gautam who had his hand up first. He was one of the first people.
I think so, I actually thought that you were referring to him. So,
No, it's fine. I mean, I'm just saying he has it young. He was like the first person to him.
okay, okay.
So Aditya post, that's really interesting. And my instinct is to say that if we think of democracy in the direction in which I think it is going, this kind of movements towards, it may not. These are not prophecies, right? One is simply looking at certain possibilities. And if direct democracy is going to emerge in more localized, and with massive climate change, all of this, there might be more and more, there could be greater and greater centralization, but there's equally possibilities of communities taking control of their own resources. And in that case, one constitution for a landmass that we call a state could be an obstruction. So it is possible, it's that this moment, this historical moment, which could be 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, essentially, I don't know, that this historical moment which is producing the constitution in a particular way, particularly in the global south, because of the history of anti-imperialism, etc., this moment is producing the constitution in this way, as an empty signifier, read in different ways by different movements, right? Being a banner in different ways, this moment may change, and it may be a constitution, may be one constitution, may be an obstacle in the direction of direct democracy, may be an obstacle to that. So I would imagine that any community, though, would need a certain set of principles to regulate interaction. And whether one calls that a constitution or not, I don't know. So I don't, if you think of constitution in a general sense as something that sets up ways in which we can talk about disagreements, resolve disagreements, not resolve disagreements, etc. If you think of a constitution as that, then I don't envisage any way in which humans can live with each other and in nature without any such thing. But this kind of one constitution for a large landmass, maybe may not be what we'll see 100 years from now or 50 years from now. So it's a good question. It's worth thinking about. I'm not giving you an answer. I'm just thinking about it. Gautam, that the two parts to your question, at least I see it as two parts. One is, yes, Dr. Ambedkar did say that now we have the constitution, we have to let go. My sense is that he was afraid, to link to the earlier question about the lack of dignity and solidarity. Rather than fraternity, I prefer to use the term solidarity because it's so gendered, the term fraternity, but it's okay, it's there in the preamble. Because of the he's thinking of a society driven through by caste inequality. And my sense is that he was afraid that the dominant groups would use these methods to not permit the constitution to work. my sense is that he became suspicious of Satyagraha, and also because he has experienced Gandhi's hunger strike in the face of his demand for representation, right? So the Pune Pact. So he has experienced the tyranny of this method. So I think that's how he saw it. So I'm not sure that we should please Ambedkar in that moment. I think if he were today here, he might or might not say the same thing, because today, in fact, it is against caste repression that many of these methods are being used. So I'm not sure that we should please him at that moment. I'm trying to understand why he might have said it, and this is my sense. So you're saying that lawyers see the Constitution as depoliticized, and it's an attempt to establish a kind of neutral space. And that is why I'm not sure that social transformation can be entirely fought in courts, right? So I have an argument. So part of the critiques that I said, the critiques of going to the law, are critiques that I would participate in, and I think there are very important ways in which the law can work, but it's more not. I think it's not to generate new rights, but to prevent authoritarianism, to prevent discrimination. So it's more like. And in that sense, although lawyers might think that they are being neutral, I don't. If you look at some of the judgments, and many judgments actually reflect the arguments lawyers make in court, as we know. I don't think judgments are even appearing to be free of politics, whether for the better or for the worse. Politics and values and ethics and ambitions and ideas of the future and ideas of the past, that's what lawyers talk about in court. So they may they may have to wear the garb of neutrality, because that is what is expected, but there's nothing neutral about any of the arguments that are actually made, right? Marriage is sacrosanct, it is not sacrosanct, etc. Yeah, so performativity, Manoj, I find that, so I use the term performativity, I think you are also, in the sense in which, let's say, Judith Butler uses it, which is that performativity is what produces, there is nothing outside of performativity. That is, if you have to perform your gender, that is an everyday practice in which you produce yourself as the gender that you think you belong to. Mostly it is the gender you were assigned at birth. So performativity for me is it's a practice that materializes the vision that you're performing. Why I'm saying this is because I find that performativity still continues to be used as merely performative. So I don't use, and I don't think you're using performative in that sense, but it is used. Oh, it's merely performative. She doesn't really mean it. As if it's something that's done on stage, it's not real. That's not the way, I don't find that a very useful use of performativity. I think you're asking about performativity in the other sense. And in that sense, every time the Constitution is performed in a particular way, it is being materialized. So when Danish's play uses this term contempt, it's just such a brilliant title, think about it. It's about trans people and queer people and the contempt you feel for them and the contempt of court, right? So it's a very dense word. And then why does a legal scholar then produce a play, right? So there are layers in which Danish's ideas are being materialized. So performativity as materializing the vision is how I see it. Every time every time I depilate myself, I'm performing my gender. There's a material consequence to that, right? Because I'm performing them. I'm performing my gender. So there's a material consequence that I'm actually acting on my body. So performativity is materializing.
Okay, so with that, we'll close the discussion. As is expected for Professor Menon's lecture, the body is fat, and I think we did a pretty good job of taking as many questions as we could. I think only that group got hit behind the pillars, perhaps that was the intention, I don't know. But, so thanks also for really patiently, generously answering all the questions. I now invite Professor Ramanujan to give an opinion.
Thank you, Professor Menon, first for, of course, accepting our invitation for that very illuminating, engaging talk, and for the compelling argument of thinking about the Constitution not just as a legal text, which we sort of tend to do in a law school such as this, and perhaps also to compel us to think about letting go of our conceit in a law school of being in some senses constitutional experts and thinking about expertise of different forms of the Constitution as commons and everyone having a joint sort of ownership of it. Thank you to the audience for coming and for engaging with the talk. To Mr. Vinod and the IT team for making this, facilitating this. To Mr. Nagraj and the admin, the catering, and the housekeeping staff for facilitating the conversation. Thank you, everyone. Faculty colleagues, please do join us in the lounge. Thank you.